Hello and welcome to this session of the West Cork History Festival. My name is Ida Milne. I'm a social historian primarily of disease, but also of Southern Irish Protestant identity. And in this session, I'll be talking to Cauvery Madhavan, novelist and author of The Tainted Heart, published by Hope Road Publishing, which is a historical novel primarily concerned with identity, I suppose. It's loosely, quite closely based on the Connaught Rangers Mutiny in the 1920s during the War of Independence. The mutiny came towards the end of that extraordinary period in Irish history, which saw the Home Rule being passed earlier on in the decade, the threat of the breakup of the Union looming, but delayed by the Great War, class riots associated with the Dublin lockout, the 1916 rebellion, and finally the War of Independence and Civil War and the establishment of the separated Ireland and the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. It was a time of extraordinary tensions and conflicts over loyalties, a questioning even within families and within individuals of who we are and who we wanted to be. And that's all key to the mutiny itself. This group of men who rebel against the crown that they chose to serve and were serving in India, when they're pushed too far by what's happening at home in Ireland. So Cauvery, maybe first, before we go into the meat of the book, you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself and at your own journey as a writer. I know you've done many different types of writing other than fiction, copywriting and advertising, travel journalism. You were a newspaper columnist for quite a long time. And how do you think these impacted on your fiction writing or hindered? And I suppose what also a bigger question, what drove you to writing The Tainted, which I know has been a 20-year process as well.
And you've been with me right through that 20-year process, Ida. Thank you so much for that introduction, Ida. And thank you very much, West Cork History Fest, for inviting me to be part of your festival this year, 2021. And it is such a thrill for me to find out that Ida was going to be interviewing me, or that we were going to be chatting together about this book. Because unknown to the History Fest, Ida and myself have had, long years of friendship, and so much of the research of this book was done informally, actually talking with Ida. So, it's one of those peculiar twists of fate that the circle came around and we're here, after that initial, I think, coffee over maybe your kitchen table or my kitchen table, talking now about both our books. So, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Just to answer your questions briefly, Ida, I came to Ireland nearly 33 years ago in 1987, and I'd left a fairly busy job as a junior copywriter in India, working in an ad agency. So I guess I was writing fiction from the very start. But when I arrived in Ireland, I really didn't have an opportunity to get a job because that's just the way the rules were in those days. Spouses didn't automatically get working visas. So I spent the next 10, 15 years just literally consuming books, reading. I read a lot about Ireland, its history, and I read a lot of Irish writers of fiction. And radio as well. I listened to a lot of radio, which informed me, a great deal. So, when I wrote, when I started work on The Tainted, I think I've said this several times that, I stumbled upon the story accidentally. And when I did find out, looked a little bit into the circumstances of the mutiny of the Connaught Rangers, I felt that there was definitely a story that had to be told, because these men who had mutinied in India against the crown because of what was happening in Ireland at that time with the Black and Tans, when they did come back to India, when they did return to Ireland, immediately after Ireland got her freedom, a lot of their sentences were commuted. Some of them were shot, one soldier was shot, and two or three died during the mutiny. But the rest of them, got long sentences which were commuted when Ireland got her freedom. But when these men came back, they were really, really badly treated because they'd served the crown. And a lot of them died in abject poverty, taking their families with them. Some of them literally starved to death, and that's no exaggeration. In fact, I actually went to visit a grave of one of the Connaught Rangers in Castle Hyde in Fermoy, and Ida knows the story. I went to visit a grave of a Connaught Ranger who was so ostracized that when he died, he was not allowed to be buried in the pauper section of the Catholic graveyard, and he was actually buried in the pauper section of the Protestant graveyard. I mean, it's just an astonishing thing that the Republicans would have had such control over what happened. So I was quite determined to tell the story. But when I started writing it, I realized then, as I started writing into the first few chapters, I realized that there was actually a much larger story to be told, and that is the story of the mixed race, Indo-Irish mixed race people who come under the umbrella of Anglo Indians. So that's how the Tainted was sort of that's how it evolved, the story of the Tainted.
And this is what's absolutely fascinating to me. And when your friend writes a novel, you look forward to it in many ways, but you also have this little nervousness. And I read it, and the handling of this question of class and of loyalty is so sure-footed, Cav. I've just felt that the writing of it was quite an extraordinary journey for you of the assimilation of the many layers of Irish history, and seeing it in a way, I think, that many Irish historians don't even see it, as a kind of a class conflict, which comes through, or class tension rather than conflict. Yeah. Might be a fairer thing, which comes through. It's not just about religion, Protestant, Catholic, or whatever,
yeah.
Nationalist, Unionist. It is also a question of class.
Yeah.
And of in and out of Edward Said's ideas of the other as well. There's a lot of othering that you handle very, very delicately in the book. I was, for example, we've talked about this privately, quite delighted when I discovered that you had used some of my family names, Milne and Deacon,
That's right.
and my mother's name and my father's name in the book, and that you had actually located them within their correct class context, which was a sort of middle class kind of farmer background or whatever context. And, that made me feel the rest of the novel was extremely sure-footed. And I think that's been the general reaction by people like Sebastian Barry, who was very familiar with that period as a novelist as well, as a historical novelist as well, who's had really high praise for the book. And I suppose the other thing we should mention is that you were runner-up for a really prestigious international military history fiction award as well. I forget the name of the prize, the MAHS, is it?
No, it's the Society for Historical, the Society for Military History. It's an old, very well-established old 200-year-old society, and just I think for me that was the biggest accolade, the biggest pat on the back, was to get a pat on the back from military historians, because I was very conscious, when I started writing the book, that I had to get the military details right. And of course, Ida, I am a military child. My father was in the army, so I grew up in Garrison Towns. So I did have an advantage. I was writing about what I knew in terms of, describing military life and, the kind of the mundaneness of it in a way, because, when Irish regiments were in India, the soldiers had a very, very boring life, really, because they paraded before it got too hot, which was before 8 in the morning. And then they might have paraded again when it got cooler, which was after 6 in the evening. And in that in-between period, they just stayed in their barracks and had very little to do. So, there was a lot of boredom in the ordinary soldiers' lives, which was not the case with the officers. The officers led quite a different life. They had the clubs, they had the sport, they had the hunting, fishing, shooting, they had amateur dramatics, they painted. So they led charmed lives, unlike the soldiers, for whom it was quite a drudgery. So
some beautiful descriptions of, the soldiers going out into the townships, I forget what they're called, and, encountering, for example, the brothels and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, if one had to say, what entertainment was there for the soldiers, it was actually the official brothels, the official prostitute camps, that were totally sanctioned and in fact policed. And even military doctors checked out the prostitutes. So I mean, they were prostitutes as young as 12. So it's actually quite shocking. But that was what that was the soldiers' entertainment. So it's quite horrifying if you think of it in terms of the age of some of these young prostitutes. And but there was that that strange notion that abstinence in the tropics made you weak. Soldiers, soldiers felt that they actually had to have sex, because otherwise, they would lose their vitality and they would lose their vigor, So it was one of those crazy notions that persisted for several centuries, really.
And something which the soldiers couldn't discuss with their families either, clearly.
Yeah, no, not at all. So, I mean, the mixed race children came out of not just these liaisons, they came out of, perfectly sort of liaisons where there was no money exchanged, So, I mean, as Irish soldiers, Scots, Welsh, English soldiers, a lot of them got involved with local women, but the children were never ever brought back. Very, very rarely, would the children have been brought back, especially after the Great Indian Mutiny in 1857. When the East India Company sort of let go and the Crown took over, these liaisons were completely frowned upon, and they were absolutely, they were really sort of they were clamped down on. So the children from those liaisons were never acknowledged, and they are literally, I cannot tell you how many people there are of Irish origin in India, whose paternal line is Irish. And as you say, these soldiers were never able to talk about those women or those children that they might have left behind, of which there were hundreds of thousands, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands.
And of course, one of those mixed race characters is, well, more than one, but what one is the chief protagonist in your story.
Yes. So this young girl, when she appeared in the story, she actually changed the course of the book. Because as I was writing, she appears in the second chapter, and she kind of, it sounds so weird to say this, but she actually took over the book, in that once she appeared and sort of got involved with my Irish soldier, I had to then rethink the whole book, because then the book considerably moved away from the mutiny and the aftermath of the mutiny in Ireland, to the aftermath of the mutiny and its effects on the progeny that Irish soldiers left behind in India. So
she actually made the book a much bigger book.
Yes, absolutely.
That it wasn't just based in a single historical incident, but in something that was a much bigger question.
That's true. And I had to then rethink, was I, how closely was I going to follow the actual regiment? So by chapter 3, I knew I would have to fictionalize the regiment in order for the story to, the bigger picture story to be told. So what I did then, Ida, was I changed the name of the Connaught Rangers to the Kildare Rangers, because I live in Kildare and it's my home. And of course, Kildare has a huge military tradition. just down the road from us is Kildare Town and the Curragh with its massive garrison.
So as we sit, Cauvery is in her house, which is 2 doors down from me. We're between Clock and Straffan, and we are right in the heart of big house territory in North Kildare, where people like the Ponsonbys, the Bartons, the Cloncurrys, and several branches of the Aylmer family, who you use as your fictionalized elite in the book.
Yeah, because I was looking for for an Anglo-Irish name that would be particular to Kildare County, and I picked the Aylmers because there's so many of them, so that I didn't want to sort of pinpoint. The story was not about any. I mean, the characters are completely fictional. So, but I definitely used Straffan House, which is now the K Club, as the mental picture in my head when I was writing about the Aylmers in the book, the fictional Aylmers in my book. Their home was not so fictional in my head because it is the K Club and that fabulous house that is Straffan House inside.
And you don't just write about Straffan House, but also about the community all around us.
Yes,
yeah. Not just the elite family, but the working class.
That's right. And I mean, it's a well-known fact that a lot of people who worked in the big houses lived in Ardclough. And I am from Ardclough. Our house is in Ardclough. We're kind of I suppose we're on the edge between Ardclough and Straffan. But my kids went to school in Ardclough, and I would consider it my home. So I just decided I had to have my soldier had to be from Ardclough, and I was able to weave in the canal and several other sort of landmarks in Ardclough, like Reeves Castle as well. The bridge and the old schoolhouse, and it was such a pleasure to be able to write about a place that you actually are living in and weave it into the book.
And we had some great discussions about what the road surfaces might have been. You
remember that, Ida? Oh my God, yeah. It's actually interesting, Ida, because when the Tainted, just before the Tainted came out, when I was proofing the final proofs, that's when your book, your Protestant book, came out. Your book about about what it was like, your collection of essays, about being Protestant.
Co-edited with Ian Dalton, Protestant and Irish.
That's right.
We actually spoke about it at the last live history festival, West Cork Festival.
Yeah. So that book, the book that you and Ian edited, Protestant and Irish, I remember just literally grabbing it when it came out and racing through it to make sure that, there was nothing that I needed to change in my final, my final proof of the Tainted. And I think so many of those discussions that we've had at the kitchen table about, your own family and, all the issues that Protestants have faced, in terms of identity and, are you Irish enough or not Irish enough, or, never English enough for sure. So, all that actually informed the writing of my fiction. And of course, it's such a huge debt. My God, I can never, I'll ever be able to repay massive debt to, historians who've researched into Ireland, the connection between India and Ireland. And whose research I used.
In particular, there are there any names you suggest?
Yeah, Kate O'Malley.
Of course.
And oh my God, now you've got me on the spot there.
Deirdre McMahon probably as well.
Sorry, who?
Deirdre McMahon's work.
Yes, of course. Deirdre McMahon. Oh my God, I've.
Tom Bartley wrote about the mutiny too, and I was just looking. Michael Silvestri as well has written a really great.
Yeah. Actually, Michael Silvestri's book was one of the first ones I read. And good God, I have them in my. I have them here in my acknowledgements. And
Brian Hanley is another one.
Mario Draper as well. Who wrote extensively about it. So, I read so much of their research, and it kind of, it was such a huge help, because I knew then that at least, my fiction was based on fact, and that's exactly how the Irish were in India, and that's exactly how they were treated and how they treated Indians as well. So this book I could have researched forever, because the research was so interesting.
I know we had that conversation where you were discussing some of the historians whose work you'd inspired you. And I know there's many people who've written about this, so perhaps just in case we've left out any names out, we'll just duly apologize there.
Yeah, absolutely, because I do have such a massive debt of gratitude to historians in the who are in that field of Indo-Irish history, and really relied on getting my facts right through the work of historians. So thank you very much for all your hard work. Made it so much easier for writers of fiction like myself.
This novel was quite a shift for you. Just to backtrack a little, like your last two novels, your first two novels, Paddy Indian and The Uncoupling, were darkly comedic novels, but again about identity. So do you think in a way that kind of prepared the way for you to do what you're doing now, which is very different?
Yeah, I think, but you're right, Ida, because it's amazing how the themes, even though the stories are so completely different and have nothing to do with each other, there is an underlying theme of identity. And I think a lot of it is, I'm a first generation immigrant into Ireland. And I think as you grow older, you begin to dwell on these subjects, who are you and where are you, where are you headed, and where does your heart belong and where does your head belong? And I think for me now, because I have children who are, possibly going to have children in the next maybe, 5 to 6 years, they are going to be mixed race. And I suppose there's a certain amount of anxiety for them. And so that makes you think as a writer, and, makes your, I suppose, focuses your writing onto certain themes. And I think that's what's happened. It's just evolved. That's just how it's evolved.
It's a question that I suppose when we were much younger, we'd say didn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And now we realize that it's in some ways at the core of everything is who we are. And I suppose when you look at issues like we've seen with the mothers and babies homes recently, where people were deprived of their own identities, they didn't know who they were in the same way that you or I would know. Like, I know I come from a background of something like 400 years of Protestantism in Wexford, and yet I'll always be the other to a certain extent. In Ireland, or people like me will always be, to certain people, will always be the outsider, no matter what. And I think everybody is an outsider in some sense, in every, no matter where or who they are.
Yeah, but all the years that we've been talking to each other about this issue, I have totally understood where you've come from, because I think to a certain extent, I had that experience of having Anglo Indian friends right through school and college. And there was such a huge amount, may not be anymore, may not be in the last 10 years, but definitely, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was definitely a sense of, oh, they're different, they're not like us. And, they were labeled with all kinds of, the women were labeled as fast, and, just because they like music and dancing, that suddenly made them, that they were sort of available girls. And it was quite a horrible thing, because then I distinctly remember my father as a young officer in the army when he was commissioned in 1950. My father was commissioned in 1956. And, I remember him telling me that as a young, newly commissioned officer, they were actually formally told that they could not bring an Anglo-Indian girl to the mess, to the officers' mess. I mean, that was just such a horrible othering.
That's incredible. And yet the people that you were talking about, they were in the schools which you were attending, which were run by there were Irish religious schools. If I
yes, absolutely, yeah. But things have changed now in India, and I think even Anglo Indians themselves have, I think, reconciled over the generations to the fact that they are Indian, and the majority Indian population has also kind of reconciled to the fact that Anglo Indians are Indian. They just make up all the many diverse people and races and communities that make up modern India. And Anglo Indians have actually made massive strides in terms of being in the public eye. And they have been for many decades, they have been educators, they have been the teachers. There'd be the rare Indian child who did not have an Anglo Indian teacher at some stage, in their schooling. So there's a finally a respect for the community, that they not that they lacked respect, but there was I don't quite know how to word it. There was a dismissiveness, a dismissiveness. She's only Anglo Indian, that there was that only tag that was always attached, that kind of defined you as not being fully Indian.
When you're talking, I get a sense like that there was almost a caricature of them.
Just
the same way that certain people would have an image of the Irish Protestant.
Yeah, exactly.
And, one of the things we very much tried to do in Protestant and Irish was to show that there were many different ways of being both Protestant and Irish, that you could be Unionist and Protestant and Irish, or you could be like me, raised up in I won't say quite a Republican household, but certainly a Fine Gael form of nationalism, and very much identifying with Ireland and being Irish.
Yeah, and also the fact that not all Anglo-Irish and Protestant people came from big houses, that's such a fallacy.
Yeah, and that's something that again you bring out in your book, that a lot of them weren't big house people.
Yeah. And Anglo-Irish people, in the writing of the book, the similarities between the two groups were so amazing. I was really struck with the struggle for identity for both the groups, being denied by both their sides.
Yeah, and with your my brain has slipped. Your main character, when she thinks of coming home, she's talking about coming home. To Ireland, and talking about being in the country that her father spoke about and gave her these really strong memories of. And you describe, the hills and the scenery in the countryside that's so familiar in her mind's eye, but she's never actually seen.
She's never actually seen it, yeah. And
it reminded me a lot of the way the Irish Americans, for example, talk about.
Yes, yeah. It's a kind of a handed down memory, nearly, And for a lot of Anglo Indians in the 50s and 60s, they yearned to go home. And this home that they yearned to go for didn't want them, would not acknowledge them. And it resulted in a lot of Anglo Indians having to pick and choose who they sent out first. So Anglo Indian families, in the 50s and 60s, even in the early 70s, would have, their ambition would have been, to return to their paternal roots, which might have been England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, or, but they ended up going then to England or to Canada or to Australia. And the way they did it was, in many cases, they picked the fairest person because they were the most likely to be accepted and to assimilate. And then that one person, the son or the daughter, the fairest child, would be sent off, and then would send the passage for the next child and then the next child. And it in many cases, it went by the color of their skin, how dark they were or how fair they were. It's quite sad.
And again, it's quite hard for our children's generation to imagine the Ireland of the 1950s, 1960s was so white.
That's
I often have this joke, what do you call the black person in an escorte? And you'd say doctor. Because mostly it was doctors who would come in and train in Ireland and then work in Ireland, who would be the people of colour that societies would have been familiar with in the 50s, 60s. And
True,
then from the
true.
70s onwards, we see this wonderful change in society where we become, and that's at the stage when you came in 1981.
Yeah. And actually, there's another aspect of the book that I'd love to just quickly mention, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And just from a historical point of view, the history of the service of military chaplains.
Oh yes.
Is just such an amazing history. And I have to say that when I brought a priest into the, when I wrote a priest into the book, I never realized that he would also be so central to the whole story, and that it was very easy to do. It was very easy to make him central to the story because military chaplains were so central to soldiers' lives, in regiments of the British Raj, regardless of whether they were Irish or not. But more so if they were Irish. A lot of the soldiers couldn't read or write. It fell, one of the duties of the military chaplain was to read and write the letters home. So they were intimately involved in the lives of the men whose souls they were in charge of. And from a history point of view, the history of military chaplaincy is just so interesting. These men who went out to minister to soldiers.
And fascinating in a World War I context too, like Ed Madigan's work on the chaplains in World War I is a great parallel to the work that you've done there. I liked the way you used the priest character to actually move the story along. And maybe you just tell our viewers how you did that, to bridge from one generation to the next.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of chaplains, a lot of the military chaplains, they remained in India even after their regiments returned, because a lot of their orders would have, just asked them to stay on. And, a lot of the people that they were looking after would have been Anglo Indians, because they were all the children of the Raj. So, he was a character I actually just loved so much. And I've noticed in my writing that any character that I really love, I tend to feed them through the book. And that's exactly what happened with Father Jerome. From the moment he appears till the very end, he's eating, and I'm sort of giving him cakes and lovely Anglo Indian food.
You're terrific.
But I mean, while researching it, Ida, I came across so many diaries and accounts from, actually the Capuchin order. It was their chaplain. It was a Capuchin monk who was a chaplain to the Connaught Rangers in India, and they were very helpful to me. They were extremely helpful to me.
Oh, that was brilliant. So that you went into their archives.
Yeah. I had, it's so long ago now, I can't even remember the names, but I mean, I would have them written down in my records. But yes, I had access, and sort of a good few emails back and forth, inquiring about this, that, and the other. I suppose the beauty of it is that because they were military chaplains, and how the military history is so well archived and so orderly. Yeah. So it was easy enough, but fascinating. I mean, military chaplaincy by itself is just, you could write many novels about it. Many novels. So many amazing stories.
You used him when the characters lose sight of each other to enable them to find each other again.
Yeah. So he was a, and I wouldn't say that I used him as a device, because it just kind of happened organically, that he got involved in the life of the young soldier who was a mutineer, and then reluctantly got involved in the upbringing of that child, and then followed on, because he was a good priest. He was a good chaplain.
Warmth in his heart through in it, and
despite his initial disdain for Anglo Indian women, he kind of comes around when he realizes,
as he develops
yeah,
with the context of the book. Which I suppose brings me to another question is, as historians, we're very much bound to our sources. And you did enormous research, to do this book, and in historical archives, and where you were very keen, always checking the veracity of points and looking at things like ads to check the detail and to get it exactly right and get the tone right in each period as you moved along. But as a historian, then we're trapped in a way by this discipline, and there are times when we want to make a leap of faith. But somebody would instantly jump on us and say that's bad history if we do. So, I use a kind of device occasionally where I'd say perhaps the reader might imagine, or something like that, to point to something that I feel is there, but I can't actually ground in the archives. Whereas you're able to do this in this, delightful way in the book, that you can.
And sometimes, for all the research that while I was doing it, I did feel very often, and I know that you subscribe to this view as well, Ida, that if historians' work, the work of historians could be more accessible, even if it was written in a more accessible way, or even if it was, published in more accessible places, people would be so much more knowledgeable about history.
I think it's very sad that our best work as historians, the gold standard, is to appear in academic journals.
I know. It's a pity. It's a pity that historians are limited, to having their best work in academic journals. You're absolutely right, because, reading some of the stuff, I was just thinking, why isn't this being written about more? And I think it's because it's confined to academic journals. So you really need to get your work out there, Ida. But but then on the other hand, that's what you did in Protestant and Irish, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it was in my own sense. I actually wrote that as my own chapter in that as a memoir, rather as history, because I couldn't interview myself. So wrote it as a sort of form of memoir in order to get things down there on paper that I knew to be the case, but that I couldn't do in the standard history sense.
Yeah, and I think you have a unique perspective, being an oral historian as well. That you can actually, you're able to listen to people first-hand accounts. So that's a kind of unique perspective.
You could teach me a thing or two about oral history. You're so good at listening, and that comes through in all the pages of the book, is that you have a really acute ear for language. I was looking at some expression that to do with the tiger hunt. And that was a wonderful passage, if we might just look at that for a second, where she talks about getting ready for a tiger hunt and how sad the priest would have been that he couldn't have gone on the tiger. And you discuss this thing that's almost taboo to discuss nowadays, about the number of tigers that were killed. There were awards given out for bounties given for killing.
That's right. Yeah. A lot of that actually either came from, not from historians now. I suppose in a way he was a historian, because he wrote exclusively about wildlife, and his name was Jim Corbett. And he was known as he was the most famous hunter, if you want to call him that. Who turned and became a conservationist actually towards the end of his life. But he wrote some amazing books, about hunting man-eating tigers, and one of the most famous of them was called The Man-Eater of Connaught. And it's a book that I read as a child. I must have been only 10 or 12 when I read it. It was one of my father's favorite books, and I picked it up and I absolutely loved it. It was electrifying. And so when I wrote that, I actually took a 6-month hiatus from writing just to research the tiger hunt scene, because I wanted to get it absolutely right. And then, distill it into a chapter that was not full of jargon and not full of, Hindi words or Tamil words, to be able to explain it in English. Because the way tigers were hunted, it was quite specific, the way they were kind of, corralled slowly in the jungle. I mean, it was quite a feat of kind of people engineering, if you want to call it that, because that's what the officers and people who hunted did. They used Indian laborers and villagers to corral the tiger. It's quite a dangerous thing if you happen to be the villager and the tiger decided to turn around and have a go at you instead. So I took a 6-month hiatus from writing just to research the tiger hunt, and it was literally the best 6 months of my life, because the books that I read all of Jim Corbett's accounts, and then some accounts written by people who expats living in Malaysia and that side as well. So it was a very, very interesting chapter to research and write.
Maybe if I'll just read a little section of that, and it's written through the eyes of the diary of Rosie, isn't it? And
yes.
Michael and 3 other soldiers who were orderlies to Major Deacon Captain them, my 2 family names, and Sergeant Major McCardle, and who were raring to experience a tiger hunt. And this is what I found amazing, was this raring to, is this Irish expression coming through the eyes of an Anglo Indian. Volunteered to accompany their officers. And it really struck me quite strongly when I was reading it, that expression. I wondered if Father would be anxious about me going, but his eyes lit up when I told him Mrs. Aylmer wanted me to help her with the children. And I knew immediately he was thinking of the good old days when tigers were plentiful. Just think of it, he reminisced. It wasn't that long ago, between 1896 and 1905, that more than 900 tigers were shot in the Nilgiris. And would you believe it, child, the government was happy to pay a bounty then for every single beast that was shot. And then she continues, poor Father, he's never shot a tiger. It's such an expensive business. But we've a few black buckheads mounted in the dining room wall and a bear skin too. How our mother used to hate those heads. She always said the eyes followed her around accusingly. And I just thought that was just it was so evocative and a difficult passage to write, because, in modern context, even discussing something like that is quite difficult, I think, in the context of the past as well.
True. But sure, Ida, I would have grown up in those garrison towns that had the officers' messes, which would have had, those, exactly as I described it, the black buck heads and bear heads and all kinds of, alligators, in fact, even umbrella stands made out of elephants, out of an elephant's leg.
We actually had a poof at home.
Yeah, exactly.
And I thought that was quite normal. That was kind of what you meet in houses of people who had, worked in India or wherever. And they come, and so it's just, I suppose, the artifacts of times past and of history that we didn't really see of it as the time. It was something that as children we saw as the fascinating thing, rather than my God, what was going on there. Is there anything else, Kath, before we come to an end that you'd like to discuss? What's the biggest change it's made in your life having done this work, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest change for me is now, I am now so alert all the time to, historical events and and history that's untold. My antenna just goes up immediately. If I hear a story or read a fact, and I just wonder, why isn't it more well known? And so that's actually spurred me on to write my next book, which I've just started, and it's based in West Cork and in Glengariff, in fact. And it has a thread from 400 years ago that really more Irish people should know about, and that's what I'm going to write.
So you can give us a little bit more of a teaser than that.
Well, the story is set in the 1980s in Glengariff. And it's about a young man who comes of Irish origin, who comes to claim his inheritance, and there's no fight about the inheritance. He's got it. It's two of his granduncles who are priests have left him a house, and he comes to Glengariff to live in it. And I have a thread running through from 400 years ago, from the march of O'Sullivan Berra.
Oh my goodness! Yeah.
His march from Leitrim. I mean, from Dunboy, from Glengariff, actually, from Glengariff Forest to Leitrim. Which today is marked as the Berra Breffni Way. It's the longest waymarked walk in Ireland. And I have spent the last 1 month asking people, have you heard of, do you know of the story of O'Sullivan Berra and his long march? And a lot of people have said, no, I don't really, I might have heard about it, but I don't really know anything about it. Or some people have just said, no, they don't know about it. And these are Irish people I'm asking, So I think writing The Tainted really has, I feel the urge to tell stories that people don't know, but should know, regardless of where it is in the world. There's so many untold histories that are important.
This is just it. Is we keep thinking history is done, but history is constantly changing, and I suppose too the way we tell history is constantly changing. It's not static. And we look, I mean, a book like The Tainted couldn't have been written in the 1920s, or if it had, it would have been in a different way at the end of the 1920s. It would have been, a very different book. Whereas now you've got this hindsight, and also I suppose the perspective of your own lived life, the army brat, if you'll forgive me, but and the army child, and the life in both countries, which give your work a unique richness, I suppose. But I certainly can't wait to read the next one. I'll be looking forward to it.
Are you sure you're not going to write something in tandem, Ida, so I can sort of use your research once again?
That's a shame, but I think you've stolen a march on this one, Cav.
Well, thank you, Ida. It was wonderful to talk to you. Wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.